Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our conference on Holocaust education today, confronting extremism, hatred, and denial. We got off to an excellent start, I think, yesterday with Amy Jo Levine's keynote presentation. And today we're going to continue by getting into 3 different sessions over the course of the day, starting with our session this morning. So just a reminder to come back at 3 p.m., where we'll have an excellent session about anti-Semitism during the Nazi period and today. Part of the focus, by the way, of that session is the support for the Nazi cause that existed in the United States during the 1930s. So it should be a really interesting session with 3 speakers. And then this evening at 7 p.m., we have a truly distinguished panel. John Roth, Carol Rittner, and also Robert Erickson will be speaking about their recent book, Advancing Holocaust Studies, where they consider the state of Holocaust education today and how it is succeeding, or in some cases not succeeding, to prepare the next generation to understand the meaning of the Holocaust and how it applies to today's world. So we have a lot going on, and just as a reminder too, that the link that you used this morning to get into this session will be good throughout the conference. So unlike on Zoom, where you need a separate link for every session, the same link will work for all of the sessions of the conference today and tomorrow and Wednesday as well. The link will take you into the virtual lobby, and from there you can go into the session that's beginning that day. So I'm happy to introduce my colleague in criminal justice, Deborah Slate-Siaco, who will introduce our 2 speakers this morning.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning. I would like to welcome everybody to this second day of the conference. Today, we are honored to have Drs. Alvarez and Ronet Bachman. Dr. Alvarez is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northern Arizona University. From 2001 until 2003, he was the founding director of the Martin Springer Institute for Teaching the Holocaust, Tolerance, and Humanitarian Values. In 2017 to 18, he served as the Ida E. King Distinguished Visitor Scholar in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. His main areas of study are in the areas of collective and interpersonal violence. His first book, Governments, Citizens, and Genocide, was published by Indiana University Press in 2001. His other books include Murder, American Style, Violence, the Enduring Problem, Genocidal Crimes, and Native America and the Question of Genocide. His latest book, Unstable Ground, Climate Change, Conflict, and Genocide, was published in July of 2017. He has also served as an editor for the Journal of Violence and Victims. He was the founding co-editor of the Journal of Genocide Studies and Prevention. He is an editor for the Genocide Studies International and has served as an editorial board member for a number of other journals. He has been invited to speak and present his research across the United States in various countries, such as Austria, Bosnia, Canada, England, Germany, Lithuania, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Dr. is professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at the University of Delaware. She is co-author of Statistical Methods for Crime and Criminal Justice, co-author for the Practice of Research in Criminology and Criminal Justice, co-author of Explaining Crime and Criminology, Essays in Contemporary Criminal Theory. In addition, she is the author of Death and Violence on the Reservation, co-author of Stress, Culture, and Aggression in the United States, and also co-author of Murder, American Style, as well as numerous articles and papers that examine the epidemiology of violence with a particular emphasis on women, the elderly, and the minority population. Her most recent federally funded research examines drug-involved offenders 10 years after their release from prison using a mixed methodology design. Our speakers ask that all questions and comments be held until the end of their presentation.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that kind introduction, Deb. On behalf of Ronet and myself, we also want to thank Jim Pahark for his kind invitation to speak with all of you today at the Ethel Lefrak Holocaust Education Virtual Conference. We are honored to be here in such distinguished company and to be able to share a little bit of our work with you, especially given the focus of this conference on Holocaust education today, confronting extremism, hate, and denial, something that is very important to the both of us. Before we begin, let me confess to the fact that Ronet and I both suffer from this curse, which many academics have, which is that we often try to fill our presentations with way too much information that we want to share. Please bear with us if we need to go relatively quickly through some of the individual slides as we try to get through this material. It is a vast and complicated topic, but hopefully we've condensed the material in a way that highlights some important ideas and data and which makes sense for all of you. So with that, let me turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ronet.
Okay. So again, my task is to relate what we know about hate crimes and how we know them. But I first want to talk about the far too many events we have witnessed in the US and abroad, actually, that inextricably tie the historic anti-Semitism with hate crimes today. In fact, last week, in a federal trial against the neo-Nazi and white nationalist groups who organized the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia back in 2017, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt provided testimony that linked the historical anti-Semitism to the politics and intolerance of the present. And I don't want to misparaphrase her, so I'm going to directly quote this, and it's very powerful. This fear of active replacement by the Jews, derived directly from the historical underpinnings of anti-Semitism, is a central feature of contemporary anti-Semitism. Two animuses, racism and anti-Semitism, come together in the concept of a white genocide or white replacement theory. According to adherents of this theory, the Jews' accomplices or lackeys in this effort are an array of people of color, among them Muslim and African American citizens. Some of you might recall that among the other phrases and slurs that the neo-Nazi protesters chanted during the rally, the phrase, "the Jews will not replace us," was ever present. So not only is the hatred engendered by historical anti-Semitism inextricably related to today's climate of intolerance, but the propaganda being used to promote this hatred is using the central same playbook. In fact, in his new book, It Can Happen Here, Alex Hinton details how the increasing rate of hate crimes and the rise of white supremacy in the US should both serve as warning signs of the potential for future genocidal violence right here in our own nation. So, exactly what is a hate crime? The definition actually varies by state and at the federal level, but generally a hate crime is not a specific type of offense. It's any type of crime, whether it be violent or property crimes, which are motivated by an underlying bias or hatred. Like all intentions, of course, proving that a victimization is motivated by hate or bias is quite difficult at times. Typically, for a victimization to be classified as a hate crime, there must be some evidence that the offender or offenders were motivated, at least in part, by bias against the victim because their affiliation with some group. A defendant's statements, either in person or online, are about wanting to harm members of a certain group, are the strongest evidence that could demonstrate this motivation. But not surprisingly, such confessions are not often present. Other evidence might include a defendant's membership in a group that espoused hatred for certain groups, or the use of slurs during the crime. Without this evidence, a prosecution based on bias is often difficult to sustain. Typically, if bias or hate is proven, it's generally sentence enhancements that go along and are attached to the essential sentence for the original crime, whatever that is, assault, murder, or whatever. So in sum, individuals targeted because of their real or perceived group identity, whether it be race or ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, or some other protected identity according to any state statute, is what makes hate crime a hate crime. As such, in a very real sense, genocides can be considered extreme, systematic, and a collective form of hate crime. So how long have hate crimes been on our consciousness and in our legal statutes? While some believe that the early civil rights laws at the state level could be regarded as the first hate crime laws, the first actual hate crime statutes were not passed at the state level until 1981, and I believe California was the first state to enact them. But like all criminal statutes, today there is a great variability in the protections offered by these state statutes across state lines. In fact, 5 states still do not have official hate crime legislation on the books. So despite being on the books since 1981 in several states, hate crimes were not on the national radar until 2 horrendous murders brought these crimes to the national consciousness back in 1998. The first was the brutal murder of James Byrd Jr. in Jasper, Texas. Some of you may know that while walking home one night, Byrd was offered a ride by 3 white men. He agreed and got in the back of their pickup truck, but instead of taking him home, they took him to a remote area, beat him, spray painted his face black, and then drug him behind a pickup truck with a logging chain attached to his ankles. His body was left on the side of the road, and his head and one of his arms were found nearly a mile away after it appeared that it had been severed by a sharp culvert. These 3 white men were convicted of his murder, but there were no hate crime statutes in the state of Texas at the time. After James Byrd Jr.'s murder, just a few months later, Matthew Shepard was offered a ride home from a gay bar in Laramie, Wyoming by 2 white men. One of the girlfriends of one of the men said that they went to the bar intending to target a gay man. Matthew accepted the ride, but instead of taking him home, they drove him to a remote area on a prairie, tied him to a fence post, pistol whipped him to unconsciousness, and left him there to die. He was discovered about 18 hours later by a cyclist and was rushed to the hospital, but he never regained consciousness, and he died 4 days later. There was no hate crime legislation in the state of Wyoming at the time, and I'm sad to report that there's still no state legislation against hate crime in the state of Wyoming to this day. These 2 horrendous murders, however, were the catalyst for other states to pass hate crime legislation, as well as Congress to pass a Hate Crime Prevention Act in their name, the 2009 Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act. The most recent legislation at the federal level has just recently been signed by President Biden, and it's the 2021 COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act to address the increased violence against Asian Americans since the outbreak of the pandemic. Importantly, what these federal statutes do is that when states fail to prosecute offenders for hate crimes, they can be charged at the federal level by the federal courts. And this is exactly what is currently taking place for those who planned the Unite the Right rally, the quote that I mentioned earlier. So the next question is, what does the epidemiology of hate crime look like, and how do we know what it looks like? And this is not as straightforward as one may think. The first thing my students always say is, well, police report data. Well, that's one thing, but it's very incomplete. So generally, there are 3 avenues to explore the epidemiology of hate crime in the U.S. The first is the Justice Department-sponsored FBI data collection effort. Now, this is the Uniform Crime Reports, which is now being sort of renewed, and a new effort is taking place called the NIBRS, which collects more information about the incident characteristics. The problem is, we know that only 50% of all violent victimizations are ever reported to police, right? So we're not uncovering the vast majority of victimizations. This is compounded by the fact that this is a voluntary effort by law enforcement agencies across the country. So not all law enforcement agencies comply, In fact, in 2020, several large cities, including New York City, New Orleans, and Chicago, did not submit FBI data to the FBI at all. Chicago has not submitted for several years. So herein lie two reporting issues that are significantly undercounting the prevalence of all crime, and particularly hate crimes. The second is also a U.S. Department of Justice sponsored survey, and it's called the National Crime Victimization Survey. Now, this survey actually was brought on board in the early 70s to measure the actual crime, the hidden nature of crime, so to speak, all those victimizations that may or may not have been reported to police. And the great thing about it is it's a representative sample of over 100,000 US residents. And so it asks all of these respondents to the survey several behavior-specific questions. I'm going to come back to this slide in a second, but I want to give you an example of some of these questions. So measuring victimizations is an extremely difficult enterprise. You don't just ask, have you been robbed in the last 6 months, or have you been assaulted in the last 6 months? Because most people may not recognize an incident that happened to them. So the U.S. Justice Department uses very behavior-specific questions in the NCVS so that respondents can understand what a victimization of some kind actually is, and the entire parameters with which something may be placed within a type of assault, for example. So you can see these questions are very behavior specific. And because we know that less than 50% of violent crimes are ever reported to police, the NCVS is an invaluable tool of the true and probably most valid indicator of the prevalence of crimes generally in the US, but also of hate crimes in particular. Whoops. I want to go back to the third, and that being newspaper reports. Now, newspaper reports are good for small geographical areas like cities, and a lot of nonprofit organizations, as well as scholars, use newspapers as a way to count particular crimes within a geographical location and within a geographical time period or a time frame. So a lot of groups have done this with hate-related victimizations. Now, of course, the problem is that you can't examine all newspapers in the US, so it's not, therefore, a representative sample. But we know that typically there are several cities where hate crime occurs extensively, and so it may be a great representation of hate crimes that exist in certain cities. And I'll show you a slide in a minute about research that's been done in particular cities. So I talked about the difference between the FBI police reports and the National Crime Victimization Survey, and here you can see vividly the extreme variation across these two data platforms. So police reports, the most recent data, suggest there's about 8,500 hate crimes in the US annually, while the NCVS estimates nearly 200,000 more incidents occurring in the US. So you can see police report data versus survey data. Clearly, the survey data is capturing a much more valid representation of all victimizations in the US. The great thing about the two data sources is that the contextual characteristics that emerge across both these data platforms are relatively similar. So they're picking up typically the contextual characteristics that are similar. For example, across both platforms, the majority of hate crimes are racial and ethnic motivation crimes. The three primary general motivations are race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and religion. You can also see, I want to show you that this is some data from 2020. It's early data, and NCVS data for 2020 hasn't been released, but you can see the uptick in crimes from 2019 to 2020, especially for race and ethnicity. And that's been going on for the past couple of years, according to FBI data. But I want to highlight what's happening within these three larger domains. So within the primary motivations, we see that under the race and ethnic bias crimes, the majority are anti-Black or anti-American. Nearly half of them are. Regarding religiously motivated hate crimes, 6 in 10 are anti-Jewish incidents. And similarly, 6 in 10, over 6 in 10 actually, sexual orientation bias victimizations are related to anti-gay biases against males. So these trends are similar across both the FBI and the NCBS platforms. Okay, so I've highlighted that early 2020 reports from the FBI indicate that race and ethnic-based hate crimes have been increasing. And so I want to highlight a few of these cases, and it's very graphic and sad, but as revealed, these cases are happening not only in border communities, but across the US. In fact, the deadliest mass murder against Latinx populations occurred at the Walmart in El Paso, Texas in 2019. This left 23 people dead and scores more injured. This Walmart was targeted primarily because of the Latinx customers that frequented it. Other incidents in the breadbasket included Nicole Franklin. She was a 48-year-old woman in Des Moines, Iowa, who was driving her white SUV and saw a young 12-year-old African-American boy walking along the sidewalk. She jumped the curb and ran over him. And when she was asked by police why, she said, quote, "He was a Muslim terrorist." She fled that scene, and about an hour later saw another 14-year-old girl walking along the sidewalk, and she jumped the curb and then ran over her because she, quote, told police she was a Mexican. Fortunately, both children survived. Recall that the most recent federal crime legislation is related to the increase in anti-Asian American violence that we have witnessed since the COVID pandemic. And Alex is going to talk more about why this may be happening. But I just want to highlight here, this is research conducted by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University. And they're looking at city-level data, and you can see the extent of anti-Asian hate crimes reported from 2015 to 2020, and virtually every city, it just spikes, and it more than doubles. So hence, the federal legislative response by Congress to prevent and ameliorate the consequences of these kinds of crimes. So, and I'm sorry I've been whizzing a little quickly, but I want to get through because Alex tends to be a little more windy than me. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex. He is going to talk about the current trends in anti-Semitic hate crimes, along with, as I alluded to, possible explanations for the rise in hate crimes generally. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you, Alex.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ronet. I think. Windy, huh? Okay. All right. If we could do this handoff, I will be very happy. Okay. Let's see here. Share. Okay, doesn't look like it's come up, has it? Nope.
You have to actually pick screen 1 or screen 2.
Okay. Screen 2, share. Then window, share. No, it's not. Ronet, I may have you continue to share while and just ask you to move the slides forward. That might be the easiest way to do this because it's not allowing me to share.
I'll do that.
And that's your penalty for. All right.
Okay.
So, Ronet, would you mind sharing? Can you share it again?
Oops, I just did. Hang on. Okay. There we go. Is that where you want?
That's exactly what I needed. All right.
Okay.
So, first off, thanks again, Ronet. Great intro to much of this material, the background. And as a criminologist, this data, how we gather data is so important in terms of shaping what we know. And as this slide suggests, continuing on with the rise in Latinx and anti-Asian violence, anti-Semitism has been on the rise as well. And these photographs here, by the way, not the one on the left here, but the other two, were from the January 6, 2021 riot in Washington, D.C., when a mob stormed the Capitol building. The shirt reads, "Camp Auschwitz and work will set you free," which is a rough translation of Arbeit macht frei, a greeting that, as many of you know, was etched into the gates or the entrances of a number of concentration camps. What you can't see is that the back of the shirt reads staff. In other words, as if he worked at these camps. The man is Robert Keith Packer from Newport News, Virginia, who was later arrested by U.S. Marshals. This slide is included as an illustration of the ways in which old prejudices, such as anti-Semitism, can be reshaped and repurposed in service to current politics, debates, and national issues. What's old is what's new. Hatred is very malleable and often has very long legs. So let me briefly review a few trends in regards to anti-Semitism. We're going to move through these relatively quickly since there is a panel coming up looking at anti-Semitism in a bit more detail. So as this next slide shows, between 2016 and 2017, the U.S. experienced the largest one-year surge in anti-Semitism on record, a dramatic increase. Most of that was limited to a select number of states, but it's important to emphasize that there was no region of the country that has been immune to this kind of trend. Looking at the next slide, what we find is 2018, we saw a continuation of that trend with a variation in that the year was a lot more deadly. It was the deadliest year for Jews in U.S. history. And I do want to emphasize briefly the two shootings we have listed there. And so the first one occurred on October 27th, 2018. Robert Gregory Bowers, a 46-year-old truck driver, perpetrated the deadliest hate crime against Jewish citizens in the U.S. He went to the Tree of Life Synagogue armed with a semi-automatic rifle and a number of handguns. And when he arrived, he immediately began firing, killing two brothers who were greeters at the entrance. He then went on to roam through the building, shooting at anyone he saw. Before ultimately surrendering to the police, they actually arrived within 15 minutes. Just as he was exiting, he retreated back inside. There was a firefight that went on for a while before he eventually surrendered. At the end of the day, he had killed 11 individuals and wounded another 7. So Bowers, it turns out, had been radicalized into a white nationalist online. He was a subscriber to something called white genocide theory, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But it's a belief that white Americans and Western civilization are being destroyed through immigration. The ostensible culprits behind this fictional plot, genocidal plot, are Jews. Bowers also subscribed to another conspiracy theory that argued the widely reported migrant caravans heading to the U.S. from Central America during that year were actually part of a Jewish plot financed by George Soros aimed at undermining and weakening the United States. Conspiracy theories like these, as we'll discuss, have long been a feature of anti-Semitism. Shortly before carrying out his assault, Bowers had posted that Highest likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in. Hayes, in this quote, refers to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, an organization that works with the US government to resettle immigrants. And during the attack itself, it was reported that Bowers repeatedly shouted, "All Jews must die." Now, one of the approaches Ronet and I have always taken is to look for connections. And so one of the things that I think is revealing about these two shootings, 6 months after the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting took place, another one took place at the Chabad of Poway in California, when a 19-year-old used an assault rifle to kill one person and wound another 3. And in an online manifesto, he explained that he had drawn inspiration from similar attacks, including the Tree of Life shooting, as well as from the mosque shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, when a young Australian had killed 50 people and wounded another 50 in that mass murder. Clearly, hate begets hate, hate inspires hate. All right, continuing on, we find that 2020 continued the trend with high levels of anti-Semitism remaining in most places, and specific locations continuing to see increases. All right, now I'm not sure if this is good news or bad news. I mean, it's not good news, but if we look at the next slide, we find that it's not just the United States that has seen this increase. Rather, other countries across the world have also seen significant increases. And this is important for us to understand, because it tells us while there are local issues, local concerns, local dynamics that play out, there also are forces affecting anti-Semitism that are not just local or national, but ones that speak to, I guess, what we call broader or more global kinds of issues and themes. So what are the explanations? What are the kinds of arguments that we can use to try to make sense of what is going on? So unfortunately, as with most issues concerning human behavior, there are no single or simple answers. Instead, we have to understand that there are a number of possible explanations that often work together in complicated ways to help produce specific kinds of reactions or responses to perceived issues. And for every individual, that jigsaw puzzle of explanations might be different shaped. Different things have different values in terms of what's motivating individuals. So one possible argument or explanation concerns a potential backlash against the national trend that we've been seeing for the past few years to perhaps more honestly confront our history and identity as a nation, especially around the Civil War, slavery, and race. The New York Times columnist Roger Cohen, in a 2017 op-ed, wrote that in moments of national fragility, history rears its head. The past becomes a vast storehouse of grievance. Revived memory is manipulated to produce violent nationalism. This is what is happening today in the United States, a nation suddenly at war with its past. And Ronet and I would suggest to you, this is part of what we are currently experiencing today. Now, to keep up with this theme of connections, much of this current situation stems from the mass shooting at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, a historic Black church in South Carolina, a shooting that occurred on June 17, 2015. There was a young 21-year-old white supremacist named Dylan Roof who went to this church, and sat for an hour participating in a prayer session. Think about that, sitting with these participants for an hour, participating in this prayer session and discussion before ultimately producing a handgun and opening fire, all the while announcing that he was there to shoot Black people. Firing so often that he had to reload a reported 5 times, Roof kept up his deadly attack even after one of those present begged him to stop. He reacted to this by asserting that you rape our women and you're taking over our country and you have to go. Before eventually fleeing the scene, Roof shot and killed 9 members of the congregation, including South Carolina State Senator and senior church pastor Clemency Pinckney. Now, national news, as many of you may well remember, a huge outcry. And in response, a lot of communities began a process of thinking about and ultimately removing symbols and monuments of the Confederacy because of their overt association, glorification, if you will, of the lost cause, of slavery, and white supremacy. Now, the push to remove these symbols of the Old South were frequently met with resistance and protests from those who interpreted these actions as attacking their history, their heritage, their identity, their racial identity. And because identity is very deeply embedded, highly personal, and hugely important to conceptions of the self, many reacted with not only anger, but also with aggression and violence against those they defined as posing a threat to that conceptualization of who and what they are and where they come from. So this challenge to traditional narratives, national, regional, and racial identities has served to amplify feelings of fear on the part of some whites who see a threat to their status, race, and identity. These fears, we can argue, were subsequently amplified by the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the largest, if not the largest, social movement in modern American history. And even though the vast majority, something like over 90%, were peaceful examples of social protest, within some circles, these were portrayed as being largely violent, lots of rioting, and were largely carried out by African Americans. So reinforcing certain racial stereotypes and ideas of Black threat. So the next slide, please, Ronet. So that's one major argument that can be used to look at this. Now, another argument or other arguments have focused more on what we could call the bully pulpit of public figures, whether politicians, religious and social leaders, celebrities, and TV personalities. Now, we have to recognize we live in an age of social media with apps such as Facebook, Twitter, and Insta. And if you're old like me, Insta actually means Instagram. I actually had to check that out, but anyway. But apps like these provide platforms with mass consumers where the voice of any public figure can be amplified and instantaneously transmitted to others to go viral, to use the popular term. Now, for some individuals, the fact that highly influential and popular leaders and personalities have disseminated bigotry, prejudice, has served to legitimate those beliefs, embolden some to express such sentiments themselves, and for others to act on those feelings. And so if you look at this slide, I'm guessing you're probably well aware of the controversy around former President Trump's tweets that many have argued serve to, again, transmit and legitimate some of these kinds of messages around issues of race, violence, and these kind of things. Looking at the next slide, we have another example of a political figure. This is Senator Marjorie Taylor Greene. She has actually been linked with QAnon, which is has been connected by many with a lot of anti-Semitic kinds of messages. In this slide here, you see the argument that was made linking George Soros and the Rothschilds with California wildfires, suggesting that there were lasers that have started this as part of a global plot. Part of the message of QAnon, which she has disseminated, I mean, this is part of what she is sending out messages about, is that there exists a world cabal of Jews, often connected with rings of pedophiles that are seeking to take over the world. I mean, in many ways, this is not new. This is the protocols of the Elders of Zion given a modern kind of incarnation. It has argued that the global elite often defined as being largely Jewish, with members, people such as George Soros, the Rothschild family, and so forth, also do things like obtain children to harvest blood. The idea is that there is a chemical contained in the blood that elites harvest through torturing children in order to ensure immortality or eternal youth or something along these lines. This is a modern version of the old blood libel argument that dates back to England in the Middle Ages, in which Jews kidnapped Gentile children, murdered them to catch their blood that was then used in the making of matzah. Next slide, Ronet. Just more recently, in a successful run for the governorship of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin has suggested that school boards have been infiltrated as part of a plot to create a left liberal progressive agenda and to indoctrinate children with that kind of agenda. Again, it is about these conspiracy theories in which there are these puppet masters manipulating behind the scenes events going on in the current era. Prejudice has long legs and is very malleable. These are old tropes, old ideas that are in many ways repurposed for contemporary political or social messaging. And it's not just politicians. If we look at the next slide, we have found that Fox News host Tucker Carlson, one of the most popular TV personalities out there in terms of viewership, has in recent times openly made arguments that are all about the great replacement theory, which is in many ways this idea of white genocide. Essentially that through immigration, through changing demographics, through out-reproducing whites, that the white population is under threat of extinction, and that this is a conscious plot to destabilize and to bring about the end of the white race. And if we look at this slide, we find that people, this is not just harmless, right? That the shooters that we have listed here were all subscribers to this theory that is now being openly touted on mass, marketing or mainstream television. I guess that's what I'm getting at. All right. So moving on. So that's another explanation, this idea of social media being used by various personalities to disseminate these kinds of images and stories and conspiracy theories. Another explanation, although one tied in very closely with these others. Remember, these things don't act necessarily separately, but often in concert with each other, reinforcing and amplifying the impact of any one particular aspect. But we see a dramatic rise in the number of hate groups in the United States. Much of this growth, if we look at the next slide, not all, but much of this is due to white nationalism, aka white supremacy. And these are groups that espouse an exclusionary form of national identity built largely around the criteria of race. These groups include organizations such as the KKK, Posse Comitatus, White Aryan Resistance, and various other alt-right, neo-Nazi, skinhead, Christian identity, Christian patriot, and militia groups. Some are highly organized, some are much less. Some are highly structured, others much less. All, however, share the belief that the white race is superior to other races, is responsible for the greatest achievements in culture and civilization, and is existentially threatened by the increasing presence of non-white peoples in this country. Not only has the number and size of these groups grown, they have become more active. The Anti-Defamation League, for example, documented almost a 200% increase in recent years in the distribution of white supremacist propaganda, the number of rallies held, and these kinds of activities. Now, this kind of thinking is nothing new. And so if we look at what white nationalism is, as we see in the next slide, it dates back more than 100 years to the late 1800s with social Darwinism, this misuse of Charles Darwin's ideas that espouse the ideas that racial groups were engaged in a life and death struggle for survival a la natural selection. And just as the less fit will be essentially lost through natural selection, the idea is that human populations are also engaged in this life and death struggle for survival. These ideas are also buttressed by notions of eugenics that were also very popular, that infuse white supremacy with the dictates of needing to protect the blood and racial purity of white populations from genetic pollution through intermixing of the races. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the ideological belief system of the Nazis, you know that, for Adolf Hitler, for many leading Nazis, these ideas of social Darwinism, of eugenics, the need to protect the genetic cleanliness and superiority of the Aryan peoples from pollution and debasement was central to many of the values and ultimately the policies of Nazi Germany, and helped facilitate the T4 euthanasia program, in which the mentally and physically handicapped were targeted for extermination, precisely for these kind of reasons, and ultimately help facilitate Nazi radicalization into the policies that we know today as the Holocaust. Moving forward, and I realize I'm going through a lot of material here, but hopefully it's all making sense for you. Another focus in trying to explain this rise revolves around the issue of power. And as Ronet and I have written extensively about, perceptions of power or a lack thereof are related to various forms of interpersonal violence, including rape, intimate partner violence, homicides, and violent hate crime is no exception to this. The resurgence in white supremacy in today's society can be seen as representing a reaction to the perceived loss of power felt by some groups, especially white men. In a country in which whites, and especially white men, once held all the reins of power, enjoyed economic, social, and political superiority and control over other groups, that equation has been changing. Increasingly, the demographic composition of our society is altering, and power has become more diffuse among various racial, ethnic, religious, and gender groups. This is why so much of the propaganda put out by these groups can be summarized by slogans, some variations of which are, "We will take our country back," or "You will not replace us." Economic uncertainty and anxiety have also factored into white supremacy, a fear that is often conflated with the changing face of America in ways that increase fear of the other and which facilitate scapegoating, prejudice, and hate. People are scared and anxious about the future. They feel insecure in their lives. What was familiar is no longer familiar. And what criminological research has shown is that such feelings tend to make people more reactive, tends to make them more willing to support harsher policies. They also want simple answers to complex problems and a place to focus things like fear or anger or resentment. And this is where prejudice and scapegoating enter the picture. And unfortunately, history shows us that there have always been political, religious, social, and other leaders who are more than willing to exploit those fears and sentiments in pursuit of personal agendas, or because they also believe in those same kinds of biases. Now, one focal point in particular have been refugees and immigrants who have become a very potent source of anger, resentment, and hostility on the part of some who see their society changing around them in ways that are uncomfortable and alien. Now, our society, our culture, our traditions and values are always evolving and changing, and this is always hard. For some, it represents a transition from all that is familiar and comfortable to a world that seems foreign and confusing and dangerous. And the notion of white genocide, which we referenced earlier, perfectly captures the sense of loss and threat perceived rightly or wrongly by some whites. This is one reason why immigration has become such a hot button topic in the last couple of years, not only here in the US, but in many European countries as well. Anti-immigrant ideas have often been a main concern of white supremacist groups, which is why they're also sometimes referred to as nativists, right? Nativism referring to the practice of protecting the interests and prerogatives of native citizens over immigrants. Now, ironically, these kinds of sentiments ignore the reality that unless you're a Native American, we all came from immigrant stock at one time or other. One study looking at the websites of hate groups found that these sites often portrayed immigrants in various dehumanizing and threatening ways because they steal jobs, they're violent criminals, they're rapists, and so forth. Next slide. The evidence also tells us that we're living in an era in which exclusionary forms of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism have made significant gains. And in many nations, liberal democracy has been on the retreat. A situation summarized by the nonpartisan Freedom House when they write, in every region of the world, democracy is under attack by populist leaders and groups that reject pluralism and demand unchecked power to advance the particular interests of their supporters, usually at the expense of minorities and other perceived foes. And even long-established and strong democracies have not been immune to this trend. If we look at Germany, Austria, Denmark, Italy, Holland, France, among many others, where we've seen a dramatic rise in popular support for the same kinds of groups that we see here in the US. While these movements have been guided and shaped by local concerns and issues, they've also shared an intolerance of outsiders and have invariably stoked anti-immigrant fear and hostility. Now, the US has not been immune to these challenges to its democratic institutions and processes, a fact highlighted by the events of January 6th of this year, as well as the continuation of what we can call the big lie about the stolen election. And according to research from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, in recent years, the US has experienced substantial autocratization, in which democratic attributes have been diminished or lost. Further research indicates that in the US and Europe, popular support for democratic principles and practices have diminished while support for non-democratic modes of governance have increased. Now, as a result of these kinds of trends, we see hate crimes, anti-immigrant violence, and other forms of intolerance, prejudice, and violent conflict are at record levels in many nations, including the US. We've also seen this trend accelerate, and let me just wrap this up before moving to the last slide. We've also seen recent evidence showing that this pandemic that we are hopefully starting to see the end of has accelerated this process in which a number of political leaders have exploited the COVID-19 pandemic to fast track the dismantling of democratic institutions and constraints and have cracked down on political and social dissent. So, moving to this last slide, I realize I've thrown a lot at you here with this material. Hopefully you'll have some questions and so forth. But, you know, I think that it's almost 80 years since the end of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the question that increasingly comes up, why do we still teach it? How is it relevant to today's issues and problems and so forth? And what we have to recognize is that we teach about these issues not just for its own sake, but rather to draw important lessons for the here and now. I would argue, as in fact, we argue, Ronet and I both, that the lessons of the Holocaust directly relate to hate crime in the modern world. There are important kinds of connections that we need to understand. And as this presentation hopefully illustrates, the need now is greater than ever. So with that, I will stop, and we can just open it up for comments and questions, and hopefully see if we can't clarify or expand on some of the things we have brought up, or at the very least, hear what folks have to say.
Thank you very much, Alex. We do have a question from Miriam. She says, do you use the terms white supremacy and white nationalism as synonyms? If not, what are the defining differences?
Ronet, do you want me to take that? Do you want to take it?
Go ahead and take it.
All right. We do generally use them interchangeably. In many ways, white nationalism is a kind of belief that national identity is largely framed around or is very exclusionarily limited to a select population, right? That white nationalism is that the only true citizens or the only real citizens or the most important citizens are those who belong to a particular racial group. And so a lot of times, you know, white nationalism is in many ways kind of the same thing as suggesting that there are different groups that are hierarchically organized. That's what white supremacy is. Some groups are better than others. And so white nationalism, white supremacy, we largely use interchangeably.
The next question is from Kelly. In your opinions, are there other ways that society, parents, teachers, politicians, can help decrease these hate crimes and hate groups?
Alex, this is your area too.
Okay. Well, you know, this is the million-dollar question, right? How do we basically work to remove hate? One of the things that we had a bunch of, you saw a few of those slides that we had toward the end, is that, you know, what we are learning is that one of the main tools or techniques that we have relied upon for many years has been Holocaust and increasingly Holocaust and genocide education. In other words, also referencing other examples of this. But it's the idea that we want to understand the mechanisms, the underlying forces that help bring about the Holocaust, so that young people today are better able to resist the pressures, the biases, the prejudices that allowed the attempted extermination of Europe's Jews, Slavic peoples, and various other persecuted groups. But unfortunately, what we're learning is that, as the research is increasingly showing, is that that education has not been as effective as we had hoped. And that young people today often don't see the connections, that many of them are factually at a loss when it comes to really understanding what occurred and how those forces necessarily are not limited to one time or place. What we're also seeing is a really disturbing new trend, which is the misuse of Holocaust education, where Holocaust imagery and symbols, because they are so potent, because they have such power, have, for example, been used by various figures to suggest that vaccine mandates are the equivalent of being persecuted as the Jews were. And so there are some politicians who, for example, who have tweeted out basically various tweets and other kinds of things that use Holocaust imagery and symbols to suggest that those who resist vaccinations are being persecuted in the same kind of way that Jews were targeted, right? So at the end of the day, however, while I wish we had the answers, I think Ronet and I both have more questions concerns, then we actually have the kinds of answers in terms of what we need to do. I certainly think education is a big part of it, but how do we work to make Holocaust education more effective, more relevant at a time when it is increasingly moving from lived experience into history, right? With fewer and fewer survivors able to connect with young people today. These are challenges. I'm not sure we have the answers, but certainly I think we recognize the need to really work hard on trying to find out what those answers are and how do we work to change these equations.
I would also just add, and Alex and I have talked about this at length, that we really need it. And there's the last session in this conference, I believe, will hopefully talk about some of these issues as well, is that I know personally have tried to educate myself on how to communicate with people who think very differently than I, and how to use cognitive psychology and what we know about that to more effectively convey, what I believe, and communicate to them that I'm not threatened or they should be threatened by me. So I think we really need to look into that literature so we're not so polarized, and all of us need to really learn how to communicate better. So we truly do communicate. Rarely do we listen, for example.
Right.
Most of the time we're thinking about what I'm going to respond to next and not even listening what somebody has to say. So I think we can learn a lot from psychology in those
and I think
as well.
If I could expand on that really quickly, one of the things, as academics, Ronet and I were trained how numbers are important, data is important, and we do this with our students where we share with them what the data show. But what the evidence is increasingly showing is that approach doesn't necessarily work, right? That when you have data that challenges deeply held values or beliefs that people have, even if it contradicts what they believe, they tend to hold on to those beliefs. That we have to also appeal to people at a different level, an emotional level. Someone in the chat wrote that we need to teach love one another regardless of our differences. So if there are ways in which we can emphasize empathy, compassion, and so forth, not just data, that I would suggest is part of it. And Adam writes, are there practical ways that we can counter the spread of detrimental effects of misinformation and conspiracy theories that have contributed to the spread of white supremacist views? I would say we have to challenge them always, seriously. We're finding that if ignoring it, I think that's often been approached. We're not going to, engage with these lies, these conspiracy theories and so forth. But what we're finding is that doesn't work. It just allows it to spread unfettered. And I would suggest, as we are increasingly recognizing, you have to counter hate. You have to give people other narratives in addition to these explanations, narratives that make sense for them, narratives that essentially resonate with them, and narratives which emphasize our connections with other groups, other populations, especially those people who are seen as outsiders or who are particularly vulnerable to being targeted, such as immigrant and refugee populations.
I would like to jump back in at this point if I can. First of all, to thank you both for a truly wonderful presentation. You brought out so many important facts for our audience, and I really appreciate the thoroughness and the detail of your talk today. And I just want to echo some of the things you've said, and to go into this question a little bit more about how do we as educators respond to these developments. Deb Siaco and I were part of a panel that we threw together very quickly at the beginning of the spring semester in response to the January 6th insurrection. And I think that part of what we all need to do right now is to have the courage to speak the truth, even though we sometimes may seem partisan. I think that's the risk about it. People think, well, you can't you can't criticize political figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene or media figures like Tucker Carlson, because it seems that some people may think you have a bias of some kind. Similarly, when January 6th happened, people were hesitant to say what it really was, which was a serious attack on our democracy and an insurrection. So I think the first thing that we teachers have to do is to speak the truth and just say the facts. And of course, back them up and teach our students how to find the facts, how to look into sources that are more fact-based instead of misinformation-based, and teach them to know the difference between those things. Our democracy is very much under threat today. And as you pointed out, not just here in the US, but worldwide. And when a bully pulpit is used to foster hate and to try to stoke anger against minoritized groups, it's very, very dangerous to the entire society. And we have to say that. So I think the first thing to do is what you just did with us today, is to be honest about what's happening with the rise of hate crimes in this country and worldwide. And then the second issue, and I want to ask for your thoughts about this in a little more detail. You mentioned, and I've seen the same research, that we can't confront these issues simply by reciting the facts or looking at data or even teaching our students how to find more reliable information. Somehow we have to connect on a more emotional level. So what would that look like? Do you have thoughts about how to do that? Because as teachers, this is something I think we all have to think about these days.
Ronet, do you want me to start?
Give anecdotal information, and that is because, the last 4 years I have had, I've been faced with a lot of friends and family who have gone down a very different road in thinking. And so it's a challenge to, and Alex will tell you my usual stance is, well, that's just stupid. There's no empirical evidence for that. But I have had to train myself to say things like, I understand how you would think that way. And so just little things like that, and giving people the acknowledgement that you hear what they're saying, little behavioral and linguistic cues. I mean, we all have to learn to do that. And I'm the first one to admit, for most of my life, I've been very bad at that. So those little things go a long, long way.
Yeah, I would echo that. In fact, what Ronet was just suggesting is what the evidence shows does work. Because for me, my challenge is that my feeling is I don't want to engage, right? If you support people who propagate hatred and intolerance and so forth, I think that speaks volumes, right? But what the evidence is showing is that when you gently ask people to clarify, to explain, and you gently question, that it can help people arrive at conclusions of their own that may be something that is more supportable. I think that's a part of it. Yep. The idea that I think where we fall in short is that we think we're largely rational beings with a little bit of emotionality on top. And what we're learning, it's the exact opposite. We're largely just emotional with a little bit of rationality that we largely use to justify our choices and decisions that were mostly emotional. I think we do have to connect to people at an emotional level. We have to create, I think, and this is important, we need stories. We make sense of the world around us through these stories, these narratives, these kind of archetypes. And I think what we have to do is give people alternatives to the ones that are being propagated within certain circles that tell a story, but which is one that leads to intolerance and hate. It is about changing the narrative and doing so in a way that is more than just sympathy or empathy. It has to be also grounded in facts, right? But that connects to people at a level that resonates at the gut level rather than the head, or at the heart, not just the head.
Both answers are great. I think that's excellent guidance for us as teachers. I think when we are more gentle in our approach, when we self-disclose about our own struggles sometimes with these issues in our own families, we can create a bond, and that's really an important basis to move forward, to really hear what others are saying, not to judge them, but to discuss these things as common problems that we all need to grapple with these days because of the environment, the climate that we're living in.
Right.
Deb, I was wondering, I know you teach this as well. I wondered if you wanted to jump in on this question.
This information was fantastic. I'm actually sitting here thinking about how I could use it next semester in classes. It was thought-provoking, and I'm sure the audience had the same take on that. So again, thank you both. It was fantastic.
Indeed. Thank you very much. It was a great session. And as Alex mentioned, we're going to continue to explore these topics as we go through the conference. We do have the program at 3 p.m. today about anti-Semitism before the Second World War, and then in the aftermath of it as well. And then again at 7 p.m. we'll hear from our distinguished group of panelists on how we can perhaps reshape or reconfigure Holocaust education so that we can be more effective in the classroom. So thank you both very much. And that will conclude our session this morning. Again, please join us today at 3 p.m. for the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.